Today we are going to be studying the chapter from the book Honeydew called The Best Christmas Present in the World. Now, there are some dates of time in the history of the world that are so significant that everyone knows and remembers them. The story we'll be reading today mentions one such date and event, a war between the British and the Germans in 1914. Let us begin. I spotted it in a junk shop in Bridport, a roll-top desk. The man said it was early 19th century and oak. I had wanted one, but they were far too expensive. This one was in a bad condition. The roll top in several pieces, one leg clumsily mended, scotch marks all down one side. It was going for very little money. I thought I could restore it. It would be a risk, a challenge, but I had to have it. I paid the man and brought it back to my workroom at the back of the garage. I began working on it on Christmas Eve. I removed the roll top completely and pulled out the drawers. The veneer had lifted almost everywhere. It looked like water damage to me. Both fire and water had clearly taken their toll on this desk. The last drawer was stuck fast. I tried all I could to ease it out gently. In the end, I used brute force. I struck it sharply with the side of my fist, and the drawer flew open to reveal a shallow space underneath, a secret drawer. There was something in there. I reached in and took out a small black tin box. Sellotaped to the top of it was a piece of lined notepaper, and written on it in shaky handwriting, Jim's last letter, received January 25th, 1915, to be buried with me when the time comes. I knew as I did that it was wrong of me to open the box, but curiosity got the better of my scruples. Now here scruples means feelings that make you hesitate to do something wrong. It usually does. Inside the box there was an envelope. The address read, Mrs. Jim McPherson, 12 Copper Beaches, Bridport, Dorset. I took out the letter and unfolded it. It was written in pencil and dated at the top December 26th, 1914. Dearest Connie, now Connie is a name. I write to you in a much happier frame of mind, because something wonderful has just happened that I must tell you about at once. We were all standing in our trenches yesterday morning. Now trenches means long ditches in the ground where soldiers hide from the enemy. It was crisp and quite all about, as beautiful a morning as I've ever seen, as cold and frosty as a Christmas morning should be. I should like to be able to tell you that we began it, but the truth I'm ashamed to say is that Fritz began it. Fritz is a name for a German soldier. That's what they call German soldiers in general. First, someone saw a white flag waving from the trenches opposite. Then they were calling out to us from across no man's land, Happy Christmas, Tommy, Happy Christmas. When we had got over the surprise, some of us shouted back, Same to you, Fritz, same to you. I thought that would be that. We all did. But then suddenly one of them was up there in his grey greatcoat and waving a white flag. Don't shoot, lads, someone shouted, and no one did. Then there was another Fritz upon the parapet, and another. Keep your heads down, I told the men. It's a trick, but it wasn't. One of the Germans was waving a bottle above his head. It is Christmas Day, Tommy. We have Schnapps. Now Schnapps is a German drink made from grain. We have sausage. We meet you, yes? By this time there were dozens of them walking towards us across no man's land, and not a rifle between them. Little Private Morris was the first up. Come on, boys, what are we waiting for? And then there was no stopping them. I was the officer. I should have stopped them there and then, I suppose, but the truth is, that had never even occurred to me I should. All along their line and ours, I could see men walking slowly towards one another, grey coats, khaki coats meeting in the middle, and I was one of them. I was part of this. In the middle of the war, we were making peace. Now, whatever has happened till now in this letter is basically occurring on Christmas Day, and it's about the British soldiers and the German soldiers. Now we both know that war is not how this world should have functioned. War creates destruction, and that is what the soldiers are feeling right now. It's Christmas Day, it's an important festival for them, and all they want is to celebrate with each other. Surpassing all boundaries, the Germans have come to greet them, showing their white flags. It could have been a trick, but it wasn't. And that was the beauty of this story, that everyone in the end wants peace, even if they are soldiers who are risking their lives for the country. Moving on. You cannot imagine, dearest Connie, my feelings as I looked into the eyes of the Fritz officer, who approached me, hand outstretched. Hans Wolf, he said, gripping my hand warmly and holding it. I am from Dusseldorf. I play the cello in the orchestra. The cello is a musical instrument like a large violin. He goes on to say Happy Christmas. Captain Jim McPherson, I replied, and a Happy Christmas to you too. I am a school teacher from Dorset, in the west of England. Ah, Dorset, he smiled. I know this place. I know it very well. We shared my rum ration and his excellent sausage, and we talked. Connie, how we talked. He spoke almost perfect English, but it turned out that he had never set foot in Dorset, never even been to England. He had learned all he knew of England from school, and from reading books in English. His favorite writer was Thomas Hardy. His favorite book, Far from the Madding Crowd. So out there in no man's land we talked of Bathsheba, and Gabriel Oak, and Sergeant Troy, and Dorset. Now I don't know if you all have heard of the movie Conjuring. So in the Conjuring they have mentioned the name Bathsheba. So Bathsheba was basically considered to be a witch. So they talked about all kinds of legends, myths. They spoke about favorite books, and he was most surprised about the fact that this German soldier, the Fritz, as they called him, his name was Hans Wolf. As to how he knew English, he knew it just by reading. And usually soldiers should know languages of the enemy they're facing in case of any stealth operation or whatever, and they have to sneak into their country. So that's how he knew about all this. Now moving on. He had a wife and one son, born just 6 months ago. As I looked about me, there were huddles of khaki and grey everywhere, all over no man's land, smoking, laughing, talking, drinking, and eating. Hans Wolf and I shared what was left of your wonderful Christmas cake, Connie. He thought the marzipan was the best he had ever tasted. Now, marzipan is a sweet covering on a cake made from sugar, eggs, and almonds. Moving on. I agreed. We agreed about everything, and he was my enemy. There never was a Christmas party like it, Connie. Now, the basic theme in this chapter that they're going for is even if they're your enemy just because in a different country, doesn't mean that they are bad people. They are an enemy only because of the country they belong to. But they're pretty much the same. They also have children, they also have wives they have never met. They've also made the same sacrifices everyone else has made. They're all good people at heart. They're just doing their duty. Moving on. Then someone, I don't know who, brought out a football. Great coats were dumped in piles to make goalposts, and the next thing we knew it was Tommy against Fritz, out in the middle of no man's land. Hans Wolf and I looked on and cheered, clapping our hands and stamping our feet, to keep out the cold as much as anything. There was a moment when I noticed our breaths mingling in the air between us. He saw it too and smiled. Jim McPherson, he said after a while, I think this is how we should resolve this war, a football match. No one dies in a football match. No children are orphaned, no wives become widows. I'd prefer cricket, I told him. Then we Tommies could be sure of winning probably. We laughed at that and together we watched the game. Sad to say, Connie, Fritz won. 2 goals to 1. But as Hans Wolf generously said, our goal was wider than theirs, so it wasn't quite fair. The time came and all too soon when the game was finished. The schnapps and the rum and the sausage had long since run out, and we knew it was all over. I wished Hans well and told him I hoped he would see his family again soon, that the fighting would end and we could all go home. I think that is what every soldier wants on both sides, Hans Wolf said. Take care, Jim McPherson. I shall never forget this moment, nor you. He saluted and walked away from me slowly. Unwillingly, I felt. He turned to wave just once, and then became one of the hundreds of grey coated men drifting back towards their trenches. That night, back in our dugouts, we heard them sing a carol and singing it quite beautifully. Now, dugouts were basically shelters for soldiers which were made by digging holes in the ground and covering it. So it was still Nacht, or as we say in English, Silent Night. So, very popular hymn, Silent Night. It's usually sung during Christmas time. So, moving on. Our boys gave them a rousing chorus of While Shepherds Watched. That's another Christmas hymn, While Shepherds Watched. Moving on. We exchanged carols for a while, and then we all fell silent. We had had a time of peace and goodwill, a time I will treasure as long as I live. Dearest Connie, by Christmas time next year, this war will be nothing but a distant and terrible memory. I know from all that happened today how much both armies long for peace. We shall be together again soon, I'm sure of it. Your loving Jim. Now, this letter was from Jim McPherson to someone named Connie. Jim McPherson was a British soldier and he spoke about Hans Wolf, the Fritz soldiers who came and met them on Christmas Day, and they had a football match. They settled their scores through a football match so that none of their important lives would be lost in the war. Now, moving on, coming back to the present, to the guy who was reading the letter. I folded the letter again and slipped it carefully back into its envelope. I kept awake all night. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I drove into Bridport, just a few miles away. I asked a boy walking his dog where Copper Beaches was. House number 12 turned out to be nothing but a burned out shell. The roof gaping, the windows boarded up. I knocked at the house next door and asked if anyone knew the whereabouts of a Mrs McPherson. Oh yes, said the old man in his slippers. He knew her well. A lovely old lady, he told me. A bit muddle-headed. Now, muddle-headed means confused. But at her age, she was entitled to be, wasn't she? 101 years old. She had been in the house when it caught fire. No one really knew how the fire had started, but could have well been candles. She used candles rather than electricity because she always thought electricity was too expensive. The firemen had got her out just in time. She was in a nursing home now, he told me. Burlington House on the Dorchester Road, on the other side of town. I found Burlington House nursing home easily enough. There were paper chains up in the hallway and a lighted Christmas tree stood in the corner with a lopsided angel on top. I said I was a friend come to visit Mrs McPherson to bring her a Christmas present. I could see through into the dining room where everyone was wearing a paper hat and singing. The matron had a hat on too and seemed happy enough to see me. She even offered me a mince pie. Now, mince pie is basically a meat pie where they chop meat up into small pieces like keema basically. If you've heard of it, that's basically a mince pie. She walked me along the corridor. Mrs McPherson is not in with the others, she told me. She is rather confused today, so we thought it best if she had a good rest. She has no family, you know. No one visits, so I'm sure she'll be only too pleased to see you. She took me into a conservatory with wicker chairs and potted plants all around and left me. The old lady was sitting in a wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap. She had silver white hair pinned into a wispy bun. She was gazing out at the garden. Hello, I said. She turned and looked up at me vacantly. Happy Christmas, Connie, I went on. I found this. I think it's yours. As I was speaking, her eyes never left my face. I opened the tin box and gave it to her. That was the moment her eyes lit up with recognition, and her face became suffused. Now, suffused means a glow of happiness spread all over her face. I explained about the desk, about how I had found it, but I don't think she was listening. For a while she had said nothing, but stroked the letter tenderly with her fingertips. Suddenly she reached out and took my hand. Her eyes were filled with tears. "You told me you'd come home by Christmas, dearest," she said. "And here you are. The best Christmas present in the world. Come closer, Jim. Dear, sit down." I sat down beside her and she kissed my cheek. "I read your letter so often, Jim, every day. I wanted to hear your voice in my head. It always made me feel you were with me. And now you are. Now you're back. You can read it to me yourself. Would you do that for me, Jim dear? I just want to hear your voice again. I'd love that so much. And then perhaps we'll have some tea. I've made you a nice Christmas cake, marzipan all around. I know how much you love marzipan." The author of this chapter was, the short story rather, was Michael Morpurgo. Now, what we find out by the end of the chapter is that Jim McPherson did not make it back from the war. He had a wife and a 6-month-old son, which he never got to see. Which is how I believe Connie became confused, or she lost her mental state, because Jim never reached home. So when she sees this young boy coming up to her, she assumes it's still Jim. She's so happy that she's found something which belonged to her once beloved Jim McPherson, that all her confusion goes away in a different sense. So this was the chapter. Some important meanings in the chapter are as follows. Spotted it is to see something. Scotch marks are burn marks. Was going for is was selling for. It's an informal way of saying that. Restore means to repair. Now veneer is a thin layer of plastic or decorative wood on furniture of cheap wood. Taken their toll on means damaged. Stuck fast means shut tight. Scruples, feelings that make you hesitate to do something wrong. Standing to is taking up positions. Tommy is a common English name used here to refer to British soldiers. That would be that means that was all. That was the end of the matter. Schnapps is a German drink made from grain. Cello is a musical instrument like a large violin. Boarded up means covered with wooden boards. Muddle-headed means confused. Lit up, became bright with happiness, excitement. These were a few important meanings from the chapter. Now, The Best Christmas Present in the World is a touching story by Michael Morpurgo. The narrator buys an old desk and finds in it a letter written by an English soldier, Jim McPherson, to his wife Connie, whom the narrator goes to meet and hand over the letter. The letter has a touchy account of how the English soldiers and German soldiers wished each other Happy Christmas, celebrated the festival with real Christmas spirit, where there was no place for conflict, hatred, and violence. They set apart all of these feelings, their duties, for that very day. The letter was written on 26 December 1914, and Jim wrote in his letter that he would be back by the next Christmas, as the incident between the two armies showed how soldiers from both sides wanted peace. The narrator could not sleep the whole night. It was Christmas Eve, as he had intruded in someone's privacy by reading the letter. In the morning he went to the address mentioned in the letter and found the house in shatters due to fire. Asked a neighbor and reached where Connie was. Now Connie was 101 years, and she mistook the narrator as Jim and talked about her happiness on Jim's arrival. It was the best Christmas present for her in the world. Now, there's this section after the chapter called Working with Language. So, look at these sentences from the story. I spotted it in a junk shop in Bridport. The man said it was made in the early 19th century. This one was in a bad condition. Now, the words spotted and said and was are in the past tense. They tell us what happened in the past before now. Now, this exercise is for you all. A man got on the train and sat down. The compartment was empty except for one lady. She took her gloves off. A few hours later, the police arrested the man. They held him for 24 hours and then freed him. You've heard this passage and you should now be able to identify the verbs which are present in the past tense. Now look at these sentences. The veneer had lifted almost everywhere. Both fire and water had taken their toll on this desk. Now notice the verb forms had lifted, had taken. Sorry. The author found and bought the desk in the past. The desk was damaged before the author found it and bought it. Fire and water had damaged the desk before. The author found it and bought it. We use verb forms like had damaged for an event in the earlier past. If there are two events in the past, we use the had form for the event that occurred first in the past. We also use the past perfect tense to show that something was wished for or expected before a particular time in the past. For example, I had always wanted one. Now, a few points to think about. Are wars actually good? Do they actually end conflicts or just create more? Is something we should all think about. And what was the actual significance of the best Christmas present in the world? It was just a letter, not something materialistic, but it was symbolic. Symbolic to the love that she once shared with Jim McPherson. Is love the best gift that exists in the world? Just some points to think about. So this was the chapter, The Best Christmas Present in the World by Michael Morpurgo.